Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hannock here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer. Today, we discuss the art of translation, Eastern Catholicism, and the relation between Thomism and Ressourcement theology. Our very special and very welcome guest is Professor Matthew Meinard. He is a Ruthenian Catholic, raised Roman Catholic, in a mixed American-Slavic and Appalachian cultural context, and all of this in Southwestern Pennsylvania. Matthew is a husband, a father, a seminary professor, and a translator. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Matthew, you have become, in recent years, a distinguished translator. What's up? How did this come about?
By accident. I think I've publicly said this before, this first bit, so I don't think I'm going to get in more trouble. But it started because Tim Noon, my dissertation director, didn't answer emails quickly, we'll just say. And so I had moved to Pennsylvania. I had sent him two copies or two chapters of my dissertation, and I heard nothing for a long while. So I was adjuncting teaching, and I started reading Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange's Le Sens du Mystère, Sense of Mystery. And I was so struck both by the fact that, I mean, his style of Thomism was somewhat not what I had been presented with. And I think maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later today. And also, too, though, I saw all sorts of stuff that was akin to our mutual departed friend, John Deely, that was throughout different aspects of the chapters, actually. And I just thought, I'm going to go, this is an insane thing to do. I'm going to go ahead and translate this book. So, I had a background in French from a research perspective. But, as I once said to a Dominican who has some political connections, I said, I didn't have the benefit of a religious order to pay for me to study abroad. I come from a blue collar background. And so, I never studied in a French context to be an active speaker. So in a sense, and I know a couple other translators for whom this is true, actually, academic translators who've done a good bit of work where they say there's a certain fraud aspect that you feel. If I were to travel abroad, I would have to go find a French professor and have a lot of coffee just to sort of get active on my tongue. But so it started with that, and it snowballed by accident. I went back to the same press and asked about working on a couple of other translations, and we're sort of where we're at today. Probably going to be a little bit more selective in translating. I mean, I did probably too much. I'm a little bit burned out at this point. But also, I took on too many big projects, like big books. And that's just a lot whenever you have 300,000 words you're forever facing. But yeah, it was an accident of history.
Well, it was fortuitous. Now, currently, we're not seen on our screen, but he will emerge in the development of things. We're not seeing Mario Ramos-Reyes. However, Mario, I think, light of your going back and forth between English and Spanish, you could ask another question about this translation process.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Dr. Matthew. Well, what you mentioned, Garrigou-Lagrange, I remember the days that I went to school back in the late 70s. And he was one of the major our readings, and his translation in Spanish was very clear, very well organized, and his style was the handbook type of style, very clear. But yet, because of that, in the late 70s, he was criticized precisely because of that type of style, and people began choosing a different style, not even Thomism. Now, with that background, what do you think about the claim that when you translate someone, you cannot translate as in the same spirit or in the same literal meaning? Or what would be the difference between being a translator and an interpreter, or there is a connection between the two?
I think it's a really good question, especially that last bit helps to, I think, make a good distinction between being a translator and an interpreter, because, an interpreter has an immediate context, the people that they're interpreting for. So you almost immediately put your thumb on the scales with a kind of immediacy when you're an interpreter. Sometimes translation is more interpretation or less, but you're actually pointing out something that probably is why I had a fortuitous beginning to do this kind of work, was because his style is I mean, I might contest that it's handbook style, only in the sense that he's not quite a manualist. So I have a kind of beef about that claim about Garrigou, but that's not aimed at you. His style is very simple, though, and it does have a kind of clunky, I'm teaching in Rome, I want to be very direct, and a clear expositor of the Thomist tradition without a lot of frills. I mean, he'll sometimes go off into rhetorical flights, but there's something very paratactic and direct about his style that makes translating, in a sense, not as much. It's not just purely one-to-one, but there's a kind of way that it's hard to make Garrigou-Lagrange not, when he's especially philosophical, and particularly philosophical, and not maybe doing spiritual theology, to avoid making him clunky. Because not that one would want to render, how do I put it sometimes? I have a Ukrainian priest, I know he says he speaks Ukrainish because of the mixture of languages. So you could do that with French, right? Some mixture of French and English. But that very paratactic style of his comes through as a little bit more directly. I mean, it's hard to give him a tone without actually changing his own, to significantly change him at times, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So I think that is what you're getting at with the handbook style, because something that's interesting is when I was translating his De Revelatione, which is the closest thing to maybe like the pure manual style that he wrote, the style in Latin is exactly the same as his French style. And I think it's a little bit of cross-pollination in both directions. That the style of his lecturing at Rome is affecting his French. And I also can tell, though, in his style of Latin, he's thinking in French. It's very clear at times that his diction is in French. So, doing Garrigou was, at least, how to put it, it felt more like, and it's still, even years into doing him, it felt like translating in the sense of carrying just from one language to another. Whereas if I were to contrast that to like someone like Ambrose Gardet, his teacher, I did a book by him. It was much more rhetorical, and that's where you start to feel more and more the need to be more akin to the interpreter. I'll say that when I did that book, I probably still wasn't confident enough to really interpret, but yeah, anyway, I mean, that's sort of gone a couple directions there, but I mean, you really kind of hit on a couple of important things. They're both about his style and the art of translating. And I'm sure you've experienced this whenever you've had to interpret for people. I find it amazing to watch people live interpret.
Yes. Let me touch an issue I think is I think, at least to me, is very important. What I'm saying about Manuel's style is that when you read his works, they are very clear, they are very didactic, they are very pedagogical. It seems that he's teaching students, and it's very clear.
Mm-hmm.
Now, And then you move to a different style, which came about in the 70s or late 60s, which, let's say, Monsignor Dondane from Louvain, or Louis Pin, who were the author of existential phenomenology and all that. It's more rhetorical, more confusing, more poetics, and so on. And so there was a struggle there between these two styles. And what happened then, I think, was that if you want to understand phenomenology in this tradition, the new tradition, which somehow mixed novel theology and so on, you before read Garrigou, you were very capable to understand the new trend. But if you just read and begin studying with this new style, this phenomenology or phenomenology's approach, then you went back to Garrigou or other author like him, you had tough time understanding them. In other words, what is my point? Garrigou and many of these thinkers, scholastic thinkers, were very good in giving students the foundation to understand more sophisticated rhetorical style. And when that was abandoned, then Thomism became very confusing. And that's what happened in the 80s and 90s in Latin America.
I think
I don't know if this is a question of a rant, but
well, it is a rant that I would potentially go on, but I'm always very sensitive that as the guy who did Garrigou, I don't want to come across as immediately going on that rant, because people have a kind of predisposition to think that it's, you know what I mean, a bias coming through. I mean, I do think that's correct. Any of us who've taught know this. I mean, a didactic style is actually something that's necessary. You know, even in the case of phenomenology, I was very blessed to have a didactic phenomenology professor who was Monsignor Sokolowski at CUA. But it's not, it's not an easy entree if you don't have that. And I do think that having that kind of formation by a didactic style, even if it's in a totally different tradition, right, that's basically an developed Aristotelian tradition, gives you the philosophical chops to be able to jump in to the others. I've had this argument with someone I know who's a Jean-Luc Marion scholar. He reads Marion, probably even reads into Marion some scholasticism, but he reads him with a clarity, even in Marion's interpretations of Descartes, that the phenomenologists often, I think, lack, because they never had just sort of the basic history of philosophy with kind of the clarity of conceptualization. So I don't know. Do not know what Marion thinks, though, of the dissertation that my friend wrote on him. But so I'm just affirming in a different way your observation here, I think.
Thank you.
Well, I just as soon chew on a rock as read a phenomenologist.
Oh no.
However, I'm going to turn the mic over to somebody more dispassionate and sensitive at the same time. Valerie, what do you think about all of this, and what question do you have foremost in mind?
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you really feel about that, Jim? I'm a bit of a rookie in the room. I mean, I am, I have, I don't know, 2/3 of a degree, master's in theology, but no formal philosophy. I speak, Spanish was my second language, did live abroad, have done, a good amount of interpreting in like a medical setting. But a lot of this is over my head. So I'm kind of inclined to kind of lay some foundation, a little bit more of a foundation for people who like me are kind of like, what is all this? I'm really curious what your background is in French. You mentioned you used it in a more research context. Was it what was your foray into the French language, and how did you get to the point where you could do translation? Secondly, defining terms a little bit. I'm not sure I'm really clear on the difference between translation and interpretation, and if you could help us with that, that would be great. And thirdly, is there hope for a translator from one language and culture to another to really be able to, some would say that, to translate is to betray, as Jim put it in the sort of questions as we were preparing for today. And he put a little Latin phrase in here that I know nothing about. It says traduttore, traditore. So tell us what you think about all. I guess maybe there's a lot of stuff that I'm throwing your way to.
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean to say everyone who's lived abroad sort of has had the silver spoon in their mouth. That wasn't my claim. It was just very much directed against a context where it was, some Dominicans I knew who they were sending away so they could stay, they could basically draw on their institutional resources to be able to, learn to speak the language. In the case of French, both French and Latin, which I've translated from, it goes back to like what I studied even in high school is where it kind of all started. I really fell in love with Latin actually in high school, and I wanted to be a linguist, but my parents would have nothing of that or music, so I ended up being a computer science undergraduate major because I came from too blue collar of a background, and they would have murdered me. So I had a second major in theology, but I had to have something practical, and then I burned my career by becoming a monk for a couple of years, so that ended. Then I did some both in the course of my graduate studies and sort of some external programs as well in the languages in French and Latin, as kind of course, kind of standard course going along the way for my licentiate or my master's. I'll admit, from there, I was a beneficiary probably of the fact that the digital tools were better. They're not like they are now, but at least having some significant digital tools for parallels on difficult things enabled me to fill in some, the holes of, I did a good bit of translating for my master's because I did my master's on Maritain. So I just recently went through some notes of mine, looking up some things, and I forgot there were texts I didn't know as a graduate student. I only had the French edition of from somewhere. And so, I had all these translations from there. So, I just slowly but surely over the course of my studies, honed it that way. But I did benefit from coming at it, sort of, truth be told, what might be the tail end of normal translation because of what it's like now. Because it's changed immensely since I even started. The AI tools now are such, just in the last half year, that one current project I'm working on, I edit. Not because it's, not because I necessarily quote unquote have to, but in a sense, it lets my brain get into English more quickly because I can do scaffolding and then just have a parallel. So it becomes more like checking. I've done work where I've checked someone who's bilingual, and I've checked their English for them. So I'm checking it against their original. So I'm kind of in that brain space nowadays. I use a tool actually where I touch up a PDF, get it into a Word document, and I have it process the whole thing for me. This is very new. This is actually I've just started this though. So we'll see if I get frustrated and go back to the older. Yeah. So like I said, it really is. When I say it's an accident, I do feel like it is. I had a propensity, I think, for this, and I wanted to do something along these lines. So I was like a nerdy kid who liked Tolkien. Right. So I wanted to be like him. But it really was that kind of accident, through just graduate studies. And I just did a ton of translating. Like I just today ran across 50,000 words of Latin that I forgot I translated. I don't even remember how time. I had a lot going on, but it was back in like 2018, some stuff from a manual that I partially translated for someone else. And then I was interested in the other stuff, and I just sort of translated it. I had a lighter teaching load at the seminary, I guess. My wife's a very indulgent woman. Yeah. Now, that makes me think. I was thinking when I was talking about the tools nowadays, interpretation. I don't know. I'm not like a theorist, right? In a sense, I just have done the work. I'm not theorized about it, but I think interpretation is more akin as a skill to teaching, in the sense that you're hyper focused if you're interpreting and you're trying to figure out what's going to work for your audience. And you imagine. I remember sitting. I was a monk. I was a Benedictine. We were traveling. One of my confreres was interpreting this very active 80-year-old, 85-year-old bishop who was very energetic, speaking like an Italian, half with his hands, and he kept going. So it wasn't so much that Father Stephen, he was very able in Italian. He spent a lot of time, I think, at cafes while he was studying. I joked to him. But it wasn't a question of dumbing things down for the students who were on the trip and the others, but the situation called for effectively trying to get these ideas out in a way that he was going to be able to do it, because you only have so much of an echoic loop for dealing with the person. Because in this situation, given the circumstances, I'm interpreting this very fast talking and active bishop for this group in a way that, guess what, I'm not going to be able to stop and slow him down. I mean, because he kind of, I think, even might have tried a couple times and the guy just kept doing it. Now, that's different than saying, oh, I'm interpreting this for maybe a group that doesn't have the knowledge, but I think that's still a kind of task of interpretation as well. There's just this situatedness that reminds me of what teaching is like. Translating isn't, they're not, I don't think they're not totally disparate on the Venn diagrams, right? They do overlap. To translate is to carry across. And I mean, ultimately you want to basically, if you're doing academic work, you want to elicit, let's put it this way. Here's how I've thought of it in Garrigou. We'll set aside the other people. I want to elicit the same ideas and the same tradition, generally speaking, of vocabulary in the person who reads it. And so that might require a kind of directness, but it also, at certain key moments, it requires you not to just fall into talking like a scholastic, because I need the person who's reading in English to be able to basically think with the tradition. And it's really difficult, because I know a translation of, for instance, Cajetan's commentary on the Summa Theologiae is coming out, and it's in a more analytic vocabulary. And I understand why the person did that. And it's going to have a use, but the risk if you do something like that is that you're not going to, however, tie the person into the tradition of vocabulary that you're trying to convey, which is very important in this kind of academic Thomism, which is mostly where I started, at least. Now, literature, I've done some spiritual rhetoric, which is akin to that. Literature that's a tougher beast, right? I mean, that's where all of a sudden idiom. I'll forgive everyone for falling into idiom in the native language, except where the idiom misses something that's in the metaphorical resonance of the original, right? Because if you slip into an idiom in English for some expression, and however the idiom in French is tied up with some other things going on, I mean, you get yourself into a rat's nest of translational issues. I feel like, I guess, is it translation or is it interpretation? It's translating the idea, the sentiment, etc. I'd have to think more about it, like I said, for a kind of literary translation. And, truth be told, I'd never myself put my shoulder to that, right? Unless it's a spiritual literature, just because I do know my background, and that's not going to be my forte. So I'm not sure it's like, I don't think you can pull those apart. I'm not sure I've distinguished them clearly. I think that you grasp something of the difference of interpretation when you think of the edge case of someone like that Bishop story.
So, primarily,
yeah, betrayal happens, though. Betrayal does happen. I've had people get on my case because I've occasionally had to keep Latin in my translation, because at a certain point I just said it's so scholastic that if I say this in a philosophical language of today, it's going to be misunderstood. So I'd rather almost catch the mind of the reader. Think about some Heidegger translations can be like this. I mean, it's his own style kind of is hard, but I think you have to almost push the person to get into his mind. But there are other times too, though, where I've interpreted away from the scholastic terminology, and I've had people come at me. Here's one stupid little example that very recently a student was arguing with me about online, was the bonum honestum. I've just fallen into, I say, fitting good, because there was a translation of it by Austin Woodbury, who was a student of Garrigou. And so everyone in that line that's related to Garrigou, I just say fitting good, because I want the idea of a good in itself. And the moral good, the honest good, etc., I don't think quite catches that. But you can never translate the word bonum honestum, just never finds its way into English in a way that's acceptable. And so you can do one of two things. You can either judge every translator who puts their thumb on the scale, or if you've done enough work, you learn not to be a pedant. I don't have a ton of patience for the people who just jump down translators' throats if they do something that's somewhat understandable. And I've not had that happen to me a ton, so it's not based on too many of my wounds. But sorry, I'm like an extrovert who will bloviate. I'm sorry. So
may I jump just one thing you said, I think is what is your view on that? If you have, let's say, in my case, Maritain writings in French. What happened to me has been very curious, because when I read the translation into English, and then I read the translation into Spanish of Maritain in French, I understand French. So I find easy for me to understand Maritain in Spanish than in English. And I think it's more faithful in Spanish than in English. I assume that it is because Spanish, like French, are Latin languages. And so it's easier for the translator to translate that particular piece. And in particular books, I mean, you can put aside the quality of the writing of Maritain. Sometimes it's very convoluted. But again, it seems to me that in that case, Spanish is more faithful to the text than English, which it seems that some translations have different structure. What do you think about this phenomenon, if you will? Is that possible?
Yeah, I do. I think it's probably on two levels. I mean, English is such an odd language because it's this mixture of German and Romance languages. So first of all, one of the things that I think tempts a lazy translator, and the lazy translator sleeps in all of us, so that's, self-accusation, is that the use of cognates from French to English just can tempt you in a way that actually it doesn't help, right? So there are cognate words that I think probably out of French into Spanish are closer to true cognates. They're true in their semantic cognate, that it's just, first of all, translating the idea better. And so it's just going to structurally, everything's going to work better if you've got the right ideas communicated. Whereas there's been drift in English because you've had kind of cross-pollination of, I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that's gone on. Like all the Latinate stuff that we have is basically high culture language in English, or at least it's tended to be more the mark of a high cultured language than the Anglo-Saxon stuff, which maybe is what actually would more natively communicate. And then also too, you have structurally in English, the effect of, and I'd have to sit and think of this. I've thought it would be really neat to do this linguistic, to see where Latinate words have been affected by Germanic constructions. I'm sure this happens in the case of some verbs, just to choose one example, where you have verbs across Indo-European languages that have a prefix of some preposition on the front. And right, it's a normal thing in a Germanic language to sort of move that prefix to the end of the sentence. This is why you'll end up with prepositions to the end of the sentence, right? That gets applied to verbs that never were Germanic. That does happen in English. I bet there are other things like that too, where it's like Germanic styles of grammar are somewhere operative that make it that occlude it as well. Probably though, like if you're living in a world where your cognates are close, that enables you to immediately start thinking in your native language as well. And so you're just at a better editorial place when you'd go from French to Spanish. Thank you for that sort of factoid from someone who's reading it in the languages, because I do find some of the English translations, they're torturous, but Maritain style can be torturous sometimes. So, right. It's that's another issue, but probably the punctuation scheme even is closer. I think sometimes people don't know what to do with Francophone punctuation, because I can say that myself as having to deal with it in people like Maritain or Jean-Hervé Nicolas. Sometimes it's like a drunken sailor in their style. Right.
It's long paragraph. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Like I've gone to my wife sometimes. I've said, "God bless, Gerald Phelan." Something in like degrees of knowledge. It's a paragraph that's a sentence. Yeah.
Valerie, what would you add to this before we come to cognate closure?
I'm just sitting here going, ooh, I wish I would have been a linguist. Because it is fascinating to me, but it is much of what you're saying is kind of beyond the rim of my personal experience. But I kind of hear you saying that you think of interpretation as primarily an immediate, mostly oral sort of situation
Yeah, and the thing that comes out in that is
the audience. So you need to
the
make
audience.
Yeah. So you have certain people's imaginations, right? When my son started classical education at the age of 5, one of the first memory questions he had was, what is an idea? An idea isn't, anything we have seen, smelled, tasted, touched, heard, or thought of, and this idea that communication and words are symbols that translate, this image in one person's mind to the image in another person's mind. And I remember drawing out little thought bubbles, between stick figures to show him how, we're trying to build the same image over here in this person's mind through words, right? And yeah, just listening to all of you, it just makes me feel fascinated and wish I had a whole other lifetime to be a linguist, but I don't have any other specific thoughts besides that, James. So free to move on.
Well, if you went to MIT, you could enroll in the Department of Philosophy and Linguistics. Comes together there.
Cool. That's it.
Well, now, Matthew, this doesn't take us entirely away from translation, much less interpretation. And there's a possibility here of even some treason. But you're teaching in an Eastern Catholic seminary. And could you tell us what Western Catholics need to understand first and foremost about Eastern Catholicism? And, how do they both contribute in their distinctive ways to the universal church?
It's when you grow up in Western Pennsylvania, that beautiful land from Passaic, New Jersey to Toledo, Ohio, right? In that area, you take for granted that people have been exposed to at least various shades of Eastern Catholicism. But I've learned that it's necessary. So I'm just curious here, like Valerie, have you been exposed to Eastern Catholicism? Because I know Jim has.
Pretty minimally. I mean, I'm not sure that I don't think I've ever been to a liturgy.
Are there churches around you?
Yes, there are some.
Where are you at?
I'm in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay. Okay. So you're in mission territory for the East, though. So
yeah. So being a listener of, I listen and learn a lot about our faith and listen to Catholic media and things like that. So I've learned, that right and left lung analogy of the church.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm going to come back and I'm going to critique the lungs, but it's not your fault because I used to exactly speak like this. That'll be a lesson I'll use. See, I'm doing a bit of interpretation. I'm trying to hear my audience. I'm curious as well, though, in Mario's case, because you'll find out like the Ukrainians will have a presence somewhere. Did you have in your, maybe say at least your youth before you became, a scholar about, what kind of exposure did you have to Eastern Catholicism, Mario?
Eastern Catholicism, not much, actually, not much.
Yeah, it is to be expected. There are sections of Latin America where you'll find, exposure, but not necessarily. So in some ways it's like the elements of the Midwest, but okay. Eastern Catholicism, first of all, is in a sense a kind of misnomer. It's used, right? And there's a dicastery for the Eastern Church. But to talk about, West and East as a sort of set of blocks already includes the fact that you actually have kind of multiple differentiation within Eastern churches. So, most Catholics are by number, Roman Catholics, descending from the liturgical patrimony of various Western rites in the Latin Church. But, of course, in the ancient church, there were, the multiple patriarchates, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, later on added Constantinople. And so there are some churches, and so let's start with kind of the context out of which I come. Some churches which are derived from reunions with various Orthodox churches. So, for instance, in the Slavic world, basically from, Russian Orthodoxy, the Ruthenian and Ukrainian Catholic churches over the course of the late 16th century and early 17th century, some subdivisions of their clergy came into union with Rome, constituting what came to be known as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church. There were some divisions eventually within the Ruthenian Church because they were made up of the Ruthenian people or the Rusin people who really are, the lines of the map were drawn differently. So there's a mixture of people who are Transcarpathian or Western Ukrainian of descent, but also to Polish, Slovak, a little bit of Romanian, and also Hungarian. And so there's a Slovak Greek Catholic Church and a Hungarian Greek Catholic Church, which are derivatives from the Carpatho-Rusin or the Ruthenian Church. But they, as well as, for instance, the Melkite Greek Catholics, and then also some other Slavic groups, Romanians, Russians, etc., are churches that are derived ritually. So notice I'm making a distinction between churches and rites, because each of these churches are self-ruling or sui juris churches with the same ritual tradition, which derives from Constantinople's liturgy, codified, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, associated with, the anaphoras, which would be the canon of John Chrysostom or Basil of Caesarea. And then, the various liturgical shroudings that start to grow around that, the various hymnography, the liturgy of the hours, etc., and then the spiritual practices, and then a particular theology that's going to be more focused on the Cappadocian fathers and so forth. And so that's all sort of what we could call Byzantine Eastern Catholicism, derived from Byzantium or from the Constantinopolitan tradition. And there's some variation in there. The Melkites, who are, this means the king's men, it's because of the politics of the time, they're basically Antiochian Orthodox who came back into union with Rome. They've got variations because of more Greek influence that they had that differentiate them from the Slavs, which have either influences from later Russian Orthodoxy, but also to certain things from actually Old Believer Orthodoxy. In the case of the Ruthenians, there are elements of older Russian Orthodoxy that we have because of when we came back into union with Rome. So just sometimes these things where you see our practices differ from contemporary Russian Orthodoxy. But those groups had in America a bigger footprint on the whole because of the time of immigration around the coal mining and steel industries. So I grew up hearing tales in my family. I mean, sort of the hatred of old man Frick, Henry Clay Frick, partner of Andrew Carnegie. And even my stepfather, when he was dying, I made some negative remark about Frick's wealth, and he said to me, "You can't hold a grudge against old man Frick," which just sounds like a weird Western Pennsylvania conversation to have in 2022.
Just a second, Matthew. Does that have anything to do with the current anti-fracking movement?
Oh, no, there's no frickin' frack. No frickin'
All right. Sorry, I just had to clarify that point.
Except for the fact that the economy in this area where I live, which is poor, is a very extractive economy, and so those two things overlap with each other. So you have, though, from basically, because of both of the bituminous and anthracite coal, as well as the steel industries from New Jersey to Ohio and the Rust Belt, you have a number of various Eastern Byzantine Catholic churches that are existent, and then they spread out throughout the country. But our eparchy is kind of, you can tell when you look at the map that it's spreading out as it gets into the Midwest and then the West Coast. Now, I'm not going to go into as much detail, partly because I only myself know so much more, but there are other Eastern churches. The main lines are that there are those like the Copts who derive from Alexandria. The Armenians sort of stand on their own because of their particular history and their relationship to Zoroastrianism. The Syriacs there are two different branches of Syriac Christianity, Eastern, which you find in Chaldean Christianity. So there are a number of Chaldeans and actually Chaldean Catholics in Michigan, from what I understand, as well as the Syro-Malabars in India. And then Western Syriac Eastern Catholicism is most well known for the Maronites. Maronites are an interesting example because they basically never went out of union with Rome. There was sort of an indifference. They basically weren't aware of the fact that some people thought they might have been out of union with Rome, is how I understand it, but they never formally are what kind of derisively is called uniate. That's nowadays usually a negative term that's just used by Orthodox as a kind of slur against the Eastern Catholic churches that came into union with Rome to be called uniates. The Maronite never had a kind of existence in either Chalcedonian or non-Chalcedonian Orthodoxy. They've always been in union. So that's sort of a broad who are the Byzantines. And so that left lung, that eastern lung has a lot of different sacs in it. The West has that too. Some of that got simplified after Trent. But now why is it important? Well, first and foremost, when people talk about global Catholicism, Catholicism is not a single block. And I did grow up Roman Catholic. My family was because my mother spent a lot of time with my great grandmother. She was influenced by kind of Slavic Roman Catholicism, and I grew up with parishes that we used to refer to the Italian parish, the Polish parish, etc., as a regular marker. But most people are tempted to think, like, for instance, that like the whole world ought to be Roman Catholic. The Maronites joke the patriarch of the Maronite, or not Maronite, but the Melkite patriarch, the Melkite Byzantine Catholic patriarch of Antioch, is named the patriarch of all the East. So there's an argument to be made: all Chinese ought to be Melkites. Right, that the presumption shouldn't be that Latin Christianity, just because it lucked into being in the Mediterranean and being rich, shouldn't be the defining mark of what Christianity is. And it never was. I mean, Christianity was never born of a single context that was medieval Latin liturgical practice, thought, etc. So there's a richness to the development of ancient Christianity that continued to live on in a very different context from the urbanized Catholicism that did grow out of the in Tim Noon's world, my dissertation director, the economic boom that began in the 12th century onward. So you have in these different ritual churches, different approaches to both the liturgical year, to devotions and prayer, and to theology. And there's some simplification that people make. It's not as simple as saying that there's just Byzantine theology that's opposed to Western theology, but there still are significant differences in how one thinks within the context of one's prayer life in each of these churches. I mean, that's something I've kind of had an opportunity to grow in myself as someone who was trained still as a Western Roman Catholic, even when I was anatomism. So, for instance, there are many Byzantine Catholics who don't care a whit about Thomas Aquinas, whereas when I have Western Catholics in school, right? Like, so it's so funny. I teach a little bit for Holy Apostles online, and there are some people for whom Thomas Aquinas is the hermeneutic context of everything. And when I first started at the Byzantine seminary, my seminarians would accuse me of being too Western. And now I've had some course evals where people said, why is he wasting his time on any of this Byzantine stuff? He should keep that at the Byzantine seminary. Not a lot say that, but there are some people for whom thinking in Thomistic terms never enters into their thought stream. Some people for whom, the rosary is just never a single thought in their spiritual life. Some people who would be scandalized, truth be told, at the idea of a Western Catholic who privileges the rosary over the liturgy of the hours, for instance, because you don't have a similar devotion that way. There are devotions, like people know of the Jesus prayer, but that's very different than the rosary. It's kind of a practice of continually praying the same prayer over and over again to focus yourself, basically changing the whole of your life into an act of prayer offering to Christ and imploring his mercy. But that's kind of different than the rosary. So anyway, that was a long ramble, Jim.
All right, now here, I have to say, and I have to say this almost every program, we've only got 10 minutes left.
Oh my goodness.
Now, Mario, you could pursue such matters as we've been pursuing, or you could shift to the triumvirate of Thomism, Maritain, and politics. Your call, mi amigo, your call.
Well, I think Matthew touched on something which is very close to my heart and always has been struggling with. which is these two traditions. I'm not talking about Eastern lung of the church, rather the tradition that come from New Theology and the tradition that come from Thomism or Scholasticism. And the reason why I ran into this struggle was because basically I was formed in this, what we may call strict Thomism at the beginning. And then I joined a movement in the church, in the Western church, which propose mainly a spirituality coming from the East. So for me, it was a conflict because on one hand, the author were Gary Gu and Vernon and many Father Ramirez Spain and very classical Thomist, and on the other were quite different. And so, and I always struggle how to reconcile both, because that was being taken in the struggle within the church between because of the council and all these ups and downs. And so my question is, do you think that what you are doing by translating, incorporating the tradition of these scholastics into English, bring, I don't know if I can say a breach or reconciliation between these two traditions?
I personally hope, and my approach is different than people like my friend Matthew Levering, who's involved in kind of ressourcement Thomism, trying to apply some of the same methods of, those would be descendants of de Lubac or Hans von Balthasar, Danielou, or others, with a sensitivity to the sources of Thomas and things of that sort. It's just a different approach, which there are many flowers in the garden. We need them all. I personally, my experience basically came from the fact that when I started to really encounter Garrigou-Lagrange, myself being primordially and first a Maritain guy, that's how I got it. I walked into Thomism. I saw in Garrigou, in the sense of mystery, what it was that Maritain saw in him, even despite his deficiencies. In many ways, I would hope to be able to build a kind of like bridge that ultimately probably has the inspiration of Maritain, the desire for a kind of living Thomism, which takes very seriously the past of the Thomistic school, right? He's indebted not only to John of St. Thomas, but others, but is able to see that kind of engagement today in problems, not just of politics, but the question of spirituality, if you think about things he did and so forth, can actually meet the older Thomism and find in even older Thomists a kind of open-mindedness. Garrigou himself, there are two sides of Garrigou. Everyone knows the foot stomping he's worried about modernism in Bouillard's book during the Nouvelle Theologie crisis.
Right.
His recent book is kind of devoted to that. And most people say, oh, but he's like, he's kind of open-minded in his spiritual theology. That's very true. I'm going to close on that. But a lot of his other like early philosophical writings, even early through like the 30s, to be honest, they do breathe a kind of living Thomism. It's just muted because he's teaching in Rome. So in a sense, there's a certain trapping of the mind that happens with that. But if you think of like his spiritual theology, truth be told, you can make all sorts of connections between other schools of spirituality and thought within the broad orthodoxy of traditional Christianity, which is my way of basically saying Catholicism and orthodoxy, that I think people don't appreciate. I very often have to select them carefully, but I very often use selections from him and his teacher Gardet for my Byzantine students to try to show them how the theology of divinization and like someone like Columba Marmion, even life in Christ, how all of this has at least a deep resonance with a different patristic tradition that develops in a different context of spirituality. And I think that that's a way of reading these older figures in a slightly less closed fashion than I think some people are tempted to in some of the reactionary elements of the church today. People want to, sort of toss back before the council to a, I don't know, idealized hinterland. I don't know. But I think it's the Maritain part of my soul that actually wants to take these older figures and show how they too are open, right? Kind of, there's a sort of open way of appreciating them, even while recognizing that there's no way you would ever get Garrigou-Lagrange to write something in the style of someone who rejects scholasticism in the end of his type, right? For whatever Hans Urs von Balthasar does with Thomism or Thomas, he's not doing the kind of Thomism that is dear to Maritain and Garrigou. Even Gilson is not. Yet Garrigou's more open than his detractors would make him out to be. And I think that, that's kind of in the end, my hope is a kind of monstration to just say, here, look at the work, and appreciate the fact that it's actually communicating something open-ended that's, I think, quite valuable. So I don't know, does that answer somewhat?
Yes, I think so. My sense is that the debate in the 40s and 50s in Latin America against Maritain, back and forth, put him in a place which according to my view, is in the middle, if you will. In other words, he was bringing the two traditions together. And so he was attacked from both sides, from the scholastics, and accusing him of heresy and all that, and then the modernists. But he was in the middle. My only ignorance, if you will, is that I don't know exactly what was the influence or the contact or what Maritain thought about the new theology. That is completely out of my... I did some research, but I didn't find much about that.
So yeah, he basically was okay, Matthew, I got to be short. There are two major camps involved in that from the Dominican side. You basically have Garrigou writing in Angelicum, which most of that is basically aimed at a theory of doctrinal development. In Henri Bouillard is most of what he's kind of very vexed about that. And Maritain actually even privately went to him when he was the ambassador. They had sort of had their split already. He actually visited Garrigou, and he has a letter that Etienne Fouillou cites in a long write-up about this. I'll have to remember to try and send you that article, actually, where he reports Garrigou's vexed mostly about this. He wants a condemnation of this doctrinal development question. The other things that are kind of broader issues, right, trends, he says, you probably can't get a condemnation of that, but he was very concerned, and I think somewhat rightly, about this as a kind of modernism. Then there's the Revue Thomiste, which is actually what Maritain, he was allied with, very clearly, with Michel Labordette and others there. He's very much, the Revue Thomiste of the 40s is basically, Fouillou refers to it as they're Maritain-ists of the strict observance. They're basically openly of a kind of Maritainian bent. And so you have some private correspondence between him and like Charles Journet, where he clearly is concerned about elements in the writings that stirred that whole conflagration up. He is actually on the Thomist side, clearly. He wished for just a positive statement from the Pope, and that's it, right? So it's sort of not a condemnation, just a positive statement at the end. But he has some pretty choice words about de Lubac, where we cite, John Kerwin and I cite this. I mean, I had to double check over and over again, talk about being afraid of translating something wrong, to be honest. He basically talks about a certain intellectual hauteur that he thinks de Lubac has, that he says, which is the mark, unfortunately, for all their good of the Jesuits. That's a private letter, right? So, we should always remember, we have sent text messages and emails that we don't want people to see, right? But yeah, but if I think his position is very close to Michel Labordette in that period.
Now, friends, tempus fugit. And because of that, I want to ask Valerie one last question, and then we need the gospel for the day.
We need another hour.
Yes, and that'll be a private email, and it won't mention Jesuits. Now, Valerie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, except I'd love to. Take away. When your beloved son Henry, asks you, what was that all about? What might you say?
About this podcast?
Yes.
Ooh, man, I'm still trying to process it, to be perfectly honest. I have to do some more digesting before I could spit anything out. But
would you say there are currents, cross currents, and dangerous currents?
Yeah, I mean, I found myself wanting to I'm like, give me a link that just gives me a big bird's eye picture of these currents that we've been talking about. These, I'm worthless for my son.
None of this is going to be in the parish bulletin. Ever. Never.
No.
All right. Well, what is in the parish bulletin and what is in our parishes is always and everywhere the words of our Lord Jesus Christ. So we have the gospel from today, from Luke. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee. As he was entering a village, 10 lepers met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voice, saying, Jesus, Master, have pity on us. And when he saw them, he said, Go show yourselves to the priests. As they were going, they were cleansed. And one of them, realizing that he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice, and he fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were cleansed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God? Then he said to him, Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Thank you.
Thank you, one and all. We have to close, sadly. Tristemente.
I think I just want to say that if I had to say some words about the theme and what we're talking about, it's about the challenges of forging unity and communion within the beauty and gift of diversity. So, and you're using language and the translation of texts that help to foster understanding and gifting among minds, among peoples and cultures and time periods. And there's huge challenges in that, but it's such a valuable endeavor. And so I'm thankful for what you're doing, and I'm thankful for you giving us your time.
Thank you. It's a good way to put it. Thank you.
So we need another hour about the relationship between New Theology and Thomism. I think that's necessary. Many people are eager to hear about that.
2 weeks from today, Matthew will clear his schedule. God bless. God bless him.
Before Christmas, at least.
Before Christmas, exactly. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
Take care.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.